Female reproductive cycle. There are 2 different cycles. Is this where yours is starting? Yeah, okay. There are 2 different cycles. The whole thing is called the reproductive cycle, but there's 2 things going on in a female's body once they've reached puberty. First, the menstrual cycle, and that's dealing with the uterus. What's happening to the uterus over that month or cycle, because it's not always a month. It could be longer or shorter. And then the ovarian cycle is what's happening in the ovaries. Unfortunately, the way we talk about it sometimes is the menstrual cycle. We talk about that as being the overall cycle with the uterus part of it. So I try to say reproductive cycle when I'm talking about both of them together, and I try to separate it out. Sometimes I fall back to what you normally hear on commercials and all of that stuff. So if you need to have any clarification, just raise your hand and I'll let you know which one I'm talking about. Whole purpose of the female reproductive cycle is to produce an egg and make sure the uterus wall, that endometrium, is thick enough for the implantation of the fertilized egg. So those are the 2 main things. And it makes sense to produce an egg. It's part of the ovarian cycle, and then preparing the uterus for implantation is part of the menstrual cycle. Hormones. Hormones are chemical messengers. Sends responses all over the body through the bloodstream. That's a key thing. Hormones are only through the bloodstream. They get released from one part of the body, goes through the bloodstream to another part of the body. So hormones are produced in one part, gets released into the bloodstream, travels the bloodstream, and affects a different part of the body. Sometimes it could be close, one part of the brain to a different part of the brain, or sometimes it goes from the brain all the way down to the ovaries or the testes. 90% of this lecture is going to be on females. Females are so complicated with hormones. There's, I think, 1 slide for male. So males are simple-minded, and it makes sense that they're simple for reproductive, too. You're in there. So you have this. Your book is a better picture. This is small, but this is showing you how one will impact the other. And let me explain what that means. So, yes.
What is the corpus luteum?
We're going to get there. I promise. So it shows you what's happening. On this top, if you want to write here, this top are hormones. And you can see that FSH, LH, E for estrogen, P for progesterone, and we're going to talk about that. I might have you reference this slide back, going back and forth with this one. And it shows you how one hormone, when one goes up, let's see here, this FSH right here is starting to increase, which means that causes the lining to start to increase, and estrogen increases. Actually, no, don't say that. Back. Sorry, FSH causes this to start developing, and then when estrogen, that's the E one, starts to increase, you can see this one starting to increase. Estrogen is in charge of the uterine wall. So you can see that the hormone is responsible for either what's happening in the ovary or what's happening in the uterus. And we're going to talk about it in more detail. I'm just showing you this graph. You will have a graph, not tomorrow, but on your hormone quiz and on your test. So we'll do some graphing work another time too, don't worry. So stages of the female reproductive cycle. Typically, we start with the menstrual cycle. Menstrual cycle is day 1. If you ever go to your doctor, they might ask you what number are you in your cycle, and you always start with the day 1 being the first day of menstruation. And then so menstrual cycle, that one part with the uterus is just the menstrual cycle. The ovary, 3 different stages are happening in the ovary. You've got follicular, the follicle stage. You've got ovulation. And then you have the luteal stage, or sometimes we call it the corpus luteum stage. And those are all occurring in the ovary. So the follicular stage, follicular. The hypothalamus and the pituitary, you don't need to know anterior, just pituitary. And do you guys know where that's located? Anybody? In your brain. So the hypothalamus and the pituitary, that's actually what is responsible for starting the reproductive cycle. So the brain is responsible for kind of gauging, monitoring your entire body, which includes the reproductive cycle. It monitors the levels of estrogen and progesterone in your blood. If there are low levels of estrogen and progesterone, it's telling you that your body is ready to have a mature egg. So it tells your brain to start releasing this hormone called GnRH, gonadotropin-releasing hormones. Gonads, has anybody heard of gonads, your gonads? Those are your male and female reproductive organs, your ovaries, your testicles. Those are your gonads. And so GnRH, what's that saying, gonadotropin-releasing hormone, will tell the ovaries, hey, I'm ready for a mature egg, so that we hope that fertilization might happen. So GnRH will get released in your body from your brain, it's a hormone, and will travel all the way down to your ovary. Actually, no, not your ovary. Will travel to your pituitary gland, so in your hypothalamus, and will travel to your pituitary gland, so that is in your brain. And we'll say, I'm ready for you to release some FSH and LH. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone. What do you think it does?
Stimulates follicles.
Beautiful. If you know what it stands for, you know what it does. It stimulates the follicle, grows the follicle. It means the same thing. LH stands for a luteinizing hormone. Don't worry about spelling right now. It'll be in another slide. LH, luteinizing hormone, and that one is in charge of ovulation. So FSH stimulates the follicle, grows your follicle. LH is in charge of ovulation. So now that we have FSH in our body, so our GnRH from our hypothalamus tells our pituitary to release FSH. And that FSH, Adam, what does it do again?
Stimulates follicle growth.
Stimulates follicle growth. So the follicle begins to develop. The follicle, if you weren't the one that did the female comic, the follicle surrounds the egg and helps to grow the egg and mature the egg. So the follicle has two functions. One, it helps to mature the egg. And two, which is in step 3 of this, the follicle starts secreting estrogen. So where's the follicle located? If it's helping to grow the egg, where is it located?
Surrounds the egg.
But where? Where is that? Where's the egg?
The ovary.
Correct. So now the ovary is going to secrete estrogen. So the ovary will secrete estrogen. Releases is another term for secrete. Releases estrogen from the ovary, and that goes into the bloodstream, and it targets the uterus. So that estrogen will start to thicken the lining, endometrium, of the uterus. So everyone, can you picture that? That the ovary is releasing now estrogen, goes to the bloodstream, targets the uterus, and now the lining of the uterus will begin to thicken, which is also known the endometrium lining is thickening. Because FSH is growing the follicle, which is maturing your egg, and what is the hope of any single organism that's living? What do you want to do in life? Reproduce. That's the only point of life of an organism, is to reproduce, evolutionary speaking. And so now that we have a mature egg, we're hoping that a sperm will come and fertilize. And the endometrium, the uterus, has to be thick enough to have for implantation. So these things are happening at the same time, like it's a domino effect, that the follicle's maturing, and the follicle's maturing. I got to make sure my uterus is ready for that egg. And so then it releases the estrogen, targets the uterus, and begins to thicken the uterine wall. So that high levels of FSH, that will dictate that it's the follicular phase. It makes sense, right? FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone, and the follicular phase, you're in the follicular phase. So now that our follicle is almost mature, and our estrogen is high enough that our uterine wall is thick, it's ready. The body is ready for that egg to burst out and hopefully get fertilized. So those high levels of estrogen, those rising levels of estrogen, tell your brain through the bloodstream, tell your brain, hey, I'm ready. My uterine wall is ready. My egg looks like it's mature. Let's get that egg out of the ovary. And so the brain will release this luteinizing hormone, LH, and releases high level, and that sudden mid-cycle, meaning in the middle of your cycle, that surge in LH, that's what triggers that follicle to burst open and the egg to come out of the ovary. So that surge, so this is the easiest of all of them. You can, how you look on the graph, if you want to go back to your graph, you can see the LH spike if you're on the top graph, that LH spike. Does everyone see that LH spike? That is ovulation, and you can see, so I'm going to go back to that slide. Let's see here. Everyone see right here. This is LH. If you look at the graph, it's called LH. And then if you look down here, it corresponds with what? That egg being released from that follicle. That's the easiest one to identify on the graph because that spike in LH, that high surge, causes the egg to be released from that follicle. Yes?
On a test or a quiz, are you going to give us like a graph and we're going to have to label it?
Yes. And we can work backwards in here. Remember how I said previously that estrogen causes the lining to increase? Hey, look, this lining is increasing right here. And FSH causes the follicles to begin to grow. And then LH is what causes the egg to burst out of the ovary. So now that that egg bursts out of the ovary, go back. Now we begin the corpus luteum phase. What happens? That follicle, it's no longer a follicle because the whole point of a follicle is to develop the egg. And if there's no egg to develop, there's no job for the follicle. So that follicle actually turns into the corpus luteum after the ovulation occurs. So after ovulation, that follicle is still there, but it turns into what's called the corpus luteum, and that corpus luteum will continue to develop. The reason why is we still want estrogen to be released, because we're still hoping that egg will be fertilized and will be able to implant. And now it starts secreting progesterone. So the difference between estrogen and estrogen begins the thickening of the lining, and progesterone maintains it. So estrogen begins the thickening, and progesterone maintains the thickening of that lining. Because remember, we want the endometrium thick. We want that uterine lining thick so that it can receive a fertilized egg and embryo to implant and so that a fetus will develop. So the corpus luteum, that's secreting both estrogen and progesterone from the ovary, targets the uterus. Now that we have high levels in your body of estrogen and progesterone, hoping that a fertilized egg will implant, do you want another follicle to develop? No. If you are hoping that this one egg that just got released will get fertilized and implanted, you don't want another egg to go through ovulation. You're hoping, all of your eggs are in one basket, you're hoping that this egg gets fertilized and implant. So you don't want any more eggs for right now until this one either, does not get fertilized and washes out of the body, or if it does gets fertilized, you still don't want any more eggs. So this high levels of estrogen and progesterone that are being released from your ovary not only does it go to your uterus to keep the walls thick, but it goes through the bloodstream to your brain to say, hey, do not secrete any FSH or LH. I'm hoping this one egg will fertilize and implant, so I don't want any more eggs to continue to develop right now. And so it stops producing FSH and LH. So without LH and FSH, ooh, I spelled deteriorate, I think, wrong. That doesn't look right. Without LH and FSH, because remember, what's FSH in charge of? Follicle stimulating hormone. So without those, the corpus luteum will disintegrate, deteriorate. And without the corpus luteum, what did we say that it secreted? Progesterone and estrogen. So if there's no corpus luteum, can you secrete progesterone and estrogen? So let's think. Is everyone thinking, I hope?
I'm thinking.
The corpus luteum was responsible, good, you're in my recording now. The corpus luteum is responsible for secreting estrogen, progesterone, right? What is the estrogen, progesterone responsible for? Maintaining the lining. Estrogen, progesterone is responsible for maintaining the lining. If your body stops releasing FSH and LH, which is responsible for keeping the corpus luteum intact, well, now you don't have a corpus luteum, which means you're not secreting estrogen and progesterone. We don't have this anymore. If you're not secreting estrogen and progesterone, what's happening? You're going to menstruate because your walls aren't going to stay thick. If you don't have progesterone and estrogen to keep your walls thick, they're going to be released. So without those two, progesterone and estrogen, the endometrium and the uterine wall is unable to be maintained. And so the lining gets shed, which results in menstruation. So that one deals with the other, which deals with the other. It's like a domino effect. So without LH and FSH, you can't have a corpus luteum. Without corpus luteum, you don't have endometrium, or you don't have progesterone and estrogen, which means you can't have an endometrium. And without the endometrium, that's menstruation, and the whole thing starts over again. Because it's a cycle. And this will be our last slide. I don't want to overwhelm you too much. We'll continue tomorrow. Is talking about what happens if fertilization happens. So that sperm swam its heart out, doesn't have a heart, but swam its heart out all the way to the fallopian tube, fertilized the egg. Now that fertilized egg, embryo, implanted itself in the endometrium. And the coolest thing, I think this is so cool, that embryo secretes its own hormone called HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin hormone. So that hormone, that little embryo, that 8-cell whatever, is secreting its own hormone called HCG. This hormone, HCG, targets the ovary and say, hey, I'm here. I'm an embryo. I implanted myself. I'm here. Keep the corpus luteum intact so that corpus luteum will continue to secrete estrogen and progesterone for the entire pregnancy. So that little embryo is responsible for keeping the whole uterus intact for that fetus. Without that HCG, so sometimes the embryo doesn't have high enough levels of HCG, And so it's not high enough to tell the ovary, hey, I'm here. And so that's a miscarriage when that happens, when it's not high enough. Without that HCG, menstruation will happen. Pregnancy test that you buy in the store that you pee on the stick, that is checking for levels of HCG in the urine. And so if the levels are high enough to indicate that a female is pregnant, it will be a positive result. Yes.
So HCG, LH, and FSH all try to stay in the corpus luteum.
Correct. Very good. Going to Adam's question about twins. There are two types of twins, identical twins and fraternal twins. Identical twin is when the fertilized egg actually splits in half. So one egg was released from the ovary, but during the process of going through cell division, it actually split into two different eggs. And so the exact same DNA, the exact same gender, everything, that's identical twins. Fraternal twins are when two eggs are released. It can either be from two eggs from one ovary or one egg from each ovary, and they both get fertilized.
What about Siamese twins?
Sometimes it happens, yeah.